So let me now share my screen with you and we'll start the presentation. Okay, there it is. You can now see my screen, and if I start the presentation you should be able to see it. And if you click the image with the presentation, you should be able to see it in full screen, right? Now you can see the presentation, but I can't see you, so I'm just going to run ahead with a lecture and we'll see how this goes. So I was invited to do a lecture for you and to choose the topic for myself, and I chose the topic of musicians' health. This is a topic that I care very deeply for, and I've subtitled it How I Recovered from Practice-Induced Injury and what I learned along the way so far, because it's been a whole journey that I want to share with you. I'll introduce myself. My name is Bjørn Hegstad, Norwegian. I work as a choir conductor, as a piano teacher, and a Timani teacher. Timani is a method for musicians for optimizing coordination, for the sake of better technique, better playing, but also for preventing injury. I'm 27 years old, and I studied at the conservatory in Tromsø and also at the academy in Oslo. In 2015, as I was preparing for my final piano recital exam, I was inflicted by an injury that was very serious, and I remember exactly the moment 2 weeks prior to my exam. When I went to the practice room, I sat down at the piano to play. As soon as my hands touched the keys, it felt as though lightning was shooting through my arm. So I had a very serious straining injury in my forearm, and I had to take a break from playing the piano. I sought a few specialists, and I was able to make the concert the next semester. But I never fully recovered from this injury until way later, until recently. And during those years I studied various practices. I studied Timani, which is a method that I mentioned for musicians, created by a pianist named Tina Nilsson. I studied meditation, and I even trained to become a meditation teacher. I went to therapy, and I even studied therapy, how it works, and I even practiced doing therapy on a few clients, but I chose not to pursue that direction. I've been doing physical training, I've been singing, and I've been studying. I've been studying psychology, I've been studying physiology, I've been studying how the body and the mind works in order to understand my own condition better in an attempt to find a solution. I found that when I was injured, the teachers and the faculty where I studied were not able to help me with my injury. They didn't have the competence to work on musicians' injuries, and I was left kind of in the darkness trying things on my own and having to seek help elsewhere. And similarly with a doctor that I approached who was not able to help me at all. When I described one problem, they treated it as if it was something else than I was talking about. So it hasn't been an easy journey at all. I've had to figure out a lot of things on my own. And after many years of trial and error, I have been able to return to the piano in November 2020, last year. And since then, I've slowly been re-establishing a new technique and a new relationship with my instrument. And I've been going through it very carefully as to not make the injury any worse, but it has been going increasingly better. And I will say, I won't say that I've been perfectly cured of my injury, but I will say that I'm making a definite recovery. So this is a story with a happy ending, but still ongoing. And I would like to specify that I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not a medical expert. I'm not allowed to give anyone a diagnosis or to treat a specific diagnosis. But on my journey, I've learned a lot and tried different things, and I have quite some expertise, I will say, on the subject. At the same time, I talk about the subject with great respect and with great humility, because I know how complex my own situation has been, and I know how complex it can be to rehabilitate injury. So I treat this matter with humility at the same time. I don't want to claim to be uh, any kind of expert on the subject, even though I have a great deal of experience. So before we move to the next slide, are there any questions? So I'm going to ask Josh if you have any questions or comments that you put them in the masterclass text channel. And Josh, go ahead and ask any questions if there are any. And if there are none, just say go ahead. Perfect. So why did I choose the topic of musicians' health? Well, obviously it's something that I care deeply for, having had to rehabilitate my own injury. I also want to talk about it because it's something that often gets overlooked. The fact that musicians are, if you think about it, high pressure performing specialists. So I'm going to break that down word for word. So we are performers. What does that mean? It means that we prepare something, we prepare music, a recital, a performance, and then we go on stage, and we have we have only one chance of getting it right. Okay, it happens in the moment, and there's a great degree of expectation, of perfectionism, of attention to detail. And if you go on a performance and if you ask the performer how they felt about their own performance, they might say, yeah, it was all right, but I made one mistake or I made two mistakes, and they'll count their mistakes. So we're perfectionists. It's a high pressure performance where there's little room for mistakes. And at the same time, we're specialists, so we're hyper specialized for very specific tasks. So we have specific instruments and we do very repetitive motions. So a pianist operates with the hands and does very specific motions. A violinist, the same thing, striking the bow up and down, very repetitive motions with a high degree of pressure and great attention to detail. And we practice for hours every day. Well, some of us do. And that can be it's very demanding. It's a physically demanding job. And I think it's useful to compare musicians to athletes. And okay, an athlete trains and moves their body several hours a day. So does a musician. And a musician has an even more, perhaps, repetitive patterns of movement playing an instrument than an athlete who runs around, jumps around. No, I don't want to underestimate athleticism. On the contrary, I want to elevate our conception, our conceptualization of music performance as a high performing athletic, as an activity. Extremely repetitive movements, as I mentioned, and there's a high prevalence of injuries. I'm putting the number 80% here. Depending on what research paper you read, you will see different numbers. So, for example, I read a study in Denmark on orchestra musicians, where they found that as many as 84% of orchestra musicians in Denmark reported experiencing pain or fatigue when playing or practicing or performing. And typically, this can happen to all kinds of musicians, and pianists and violinists especially are prone to injury. So depending on what research you read, you can read numbers as high as 90% in some cases. So there's an urgent need for awareness and competence with this issue, both within ourselves as performers, within institutions, and in the training of musicians and in the training of teachers, to how we can reduce this number and prevent injury when training musicians and when performing. So it's a very important subject, and I believe it's urgent that we talk about it. Any comments before we proceed? We're good. Okay. So I hope this isn't too monotonous, so please ask any questions if you have them. I'm going to talk about musicians' health in general. What is musicians' health? Because we can classify it or conceptualize it in different ways. We can look at the physical aspects. So these would be the skeleton, the muscles, the joints, the nerves, and the fascia. The fascia is a term you may not have heard of before. So the fascia is the connective tissues that binds everything in the body together. So these are not only the tendons that connect the muscle to the skeleton, these are also the joints that connect and the ligaments that connect the joints. But fascia is also connects muscles across chains of muscles and in longer lines. So think of it like a piece of cloth, for example. If I pull in one end of my cloth, it will affect the other end of the cloth. Another metaphor you can use to imagine is this. If you and I are walking in a park and we're holding hands together, what happens if I stumble and fall? Well, you're going to lose your balance as well. So this is how the muscles are connected through fascia. If there's tension in one muscle, if one muscle contracts, well, that creates a co-tension in the rest of the fascia strain. So I'm not going to go into detail on the anatomy specifics, but if you want, I can refer to you some literature on that. And we can also talk. Yes? Is that the case? Well, what happens then if I cancel this presentation and I re-enter it on this slide? Does it change for you now? Hmm. Uh-huh. Like, okay, because I thought that was what I was doing. Let me look at the window. Yes, if I look at the window, then I can see the presentation software, and you can see this as well, correct? It doesn't change. Okay. So then perhaps it would be best if I continue here on just showing the presentation software and talking about it. Okay, well, that was interesting. We did a little test before we ran into the lecture, and I was thinking, well, everything seems to be all right, but then there's always unexpected things happening. But that's okay. So I'm just going to talk around this presentation software, if that's okay. You can still see the keywords, too many of them perhaps. Okay, so moving on, the physical aspects. We could also talk about the gut, the digestion, the liver. That's not so specific, and although it could be. We could also talk about musicians' health in terms of the psychological health, the mental and the emotional state. Now, those are going to be very important when I go into detail with my specific injury, because my injury was not only, it did manifest as a physical pain, but the cause was not only physical, the cause was also psychological. And within that, I find it very useful to talk about or to look at the neurological health, so the nervous system, the motoric nervous system. So that would be the part of your brain that controls movement. The sensoric nervous system, that would be the part of your nervous system that sends a signal back to your brain. And also the autonomous nervous system, the nervous system that regulates your heart rate, your breathing when you're not aware of how you're breathing, your cortisol levels, hormones, and these things. And I also put a point here that I call spiritual question mark. So can we talk about spiritual health and how it relates to musicians' injuries? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. So I'm just going to put it there as a question mark. Maybe we could be onto something here. So this is just going through it in a not so great detail. I'm going to go into greater detail right now. Now you can see the next image, correct? The autonomous nervous system. Just confirm that for me if you could. It looks fine. Great. So the nervous system. Why am I talking about the nervous system? Well, let's find out what's so interesting about it. So the autonomous nervous system is the part that is self-regulating. So this is the part of your brain and your body that works even when you don't think about it. So for example, when you're sleeping, your digestion is still working, your heart is still beating, you're still breathing even when you're not conscious of these actions. So in other words, these are actions that you can't really control consciously, and that would be a good thing when you think about it. If you had to think consciously, now I'm going to digest my food, you wouldn't have the brain capacity to do a lot of other things. So it's a great thing that this system runs itself. You're not in charge, thank God. And we can categorize the the autonomous nervous system in two different systems that co-regulate each other. And these are called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. They work as a yin and yang, so one counteracts the other. So the sympathetic nervous system, broadly speaking, simplified, explained, it increases activity in your body. It increases your heart rate. It creates stress hormones. Now, when I say the word stress hormones, that might sound like a bad thing. You might think, oh, I don't want stress hormones. Yes, you do. If your body does not produce cortisol in the morning, you don't wake up from sleep. So the whole reason you wake up from sleep in the morning is because your body is producing stress hormones. Okay, so those are good. And we need those for activity. We need those when running, when playing, when exploring, dancing, singing, and when doing goal-oriented tasks. So those would be the kind of tasks you do at work. You have a goal, you aim at doing something, and then you do it. Then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which counteracts the sympathetic one. It's commonly referred to as rest and digest. So this one kicks in after activity, when you've been eating and you need to lay down, relax, and digest. So when you're relaxing, you think, I'm laying down on the couch, I'm doing nothing. And maybe you have a nap, you fall asleep, and you think, oh great, I did nothing for an hour. But while you were doing nothing, the body was working. The body was digesting, it was healing, it was regenerating cells, the brain was working on storing memory, and all those things that you don't care about, you don't think about those things. So that part activates when we eat, when we sleep, when we relax, and you can activate it, you can engage it when you enter meditation intentionally, and it's also triggered by cuddling and gentle physical affection. Okay, so that's generally the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So one increases activity and the other decreases what appears to be activity, but when you're resting, the body is still working on maintaining itself. Everything clear so far? This is starting to become a little more technical, so it's important that you're following before we proceed. Any questions? Nothing right now. Then let's move on. So I asked a question and I was gonna put the answer in later to see if you could answer the question. What kind of neurological activity is playing music? Well, if you don't read the answer, you can think about it. Is it a sympathetic activity or is it a parasympathetic activity? What do you think when you're performing? Is it a physically engaging activity or is it a relaxing activity? Well, I'll let you know. Playing music is a sympathetic activity grounded in feeling safe, and that's a very important distinction. If we're feeling safe, then it's a sympathetic activity. But the fear of failure or the fear of rejection can unground us physically and can create tension or numbness, and I'm going to explain how that works. This is where it gets interesting, if you ask me. So let's talk about different kinds of performances. Now, I'm sure all of you have had these experiences to some degree. You've played auditions, haven't you? You have auditioned maybe for a job position, maybe you auditioned for a music program at school or a university program. And I can only talk from my own experience, but auditions, they're not always so fun, are they? And I have found auditions to be stressful. And I know that when I'm performing, or in my experience, when I have performed for auditions, I have not been able to perform as well as I wish I could. So, and that may be the experience for you also. And I'd love for you to share, even just briefly, if you could confirm if that's been the experience for you, that auditions can feel a little stressful. Same thing with competitions. You're performing, it's not just performing for an audience, it's not just performing a concert. You know that there's a jury there and they're judging you. And that can increase the level of expectation you have for yourself that, oh, I actually have to perform flawlessly because this performance will be judged. And then you have regular concerts. They can be perhaps not quite as stressful, at least there's not a jury here to judge you, but still you have expectations for yourself. Maybe you're playing a demanding repertoire. Maybe there are colleagues in the concert hall that you don't want to disappoint, or teachers. And then we have the fourth point, lessons, performing for teachers. I have known in my experience that, and maybe you've had this experience as well, going to your lesson, in my case, going to my piano lesson and feeling awful because I know that I haven't practiced. And being afraid that I'll let down my teacher, or they'll be disappointed in me or irritated. Have you had that experience? Any of you? You can just nod your head if that's the case. I sure have. And I haven't experienced this so much for myself, but I have spoken to fellow musicians who experience pressure even just practicing by themselves. I've spoken to musicians who've said that some days they feel so bad about themselves, they have so low self-esteem that just the thought of going to the practice room and grabbing the instrument and practicing just feels like, ugh, no, they would rather do something completely different. I haven't had that experience myself, but I certainly know people who have. So why is that? Why is it that these activities, performing, or even just playing at a lesson, or even just practicing, can feel sometimes so awful? The reason why is, I'll try to explain. Our human survival is dependent upon social integrity. What does that mean? Well, it means that at some point we evolved from walking around in the jungle, in the forest, on the savanna, as individuals and small families, and we moved together as bigger tribes. We recognize that as a tribe we can accomplish things that we couldn't do as individuals, and the tribe can offer us protection. And then we evolved to seek the approval from our parents, the peers, and the authorities in that tribe so that we could maintain our relationship with the tribe. But that also means that we compete for social status within the tribe, and we do that also as performers. And we have, this is the most important one, we have evolved to fear social rejection. If you think about it, if you're a prehistoric human and you're living in the Stone Age in a tribe, what happens if the tribe rejects you? You have to go out and live in the wilderness by yourself. Do you survive? Maybe, maybe not. So it's much safer for you to stay within the tribe. It's much safer for you to try to appeal to the approval of your tribe members so that you can stay within the tribe and maintain the protection. Okay, so this is an evolutionary explanation for why we care so much about our social status, and we're terrified of being rejected. We're terrified of being judged. And I want to explain to you just how deep this goes. Okay, so think of a lobster. You know, a lobster, the sea creature that you sometimes eat. If you go to a restaurant, maybe you've had lobster for dinner. Okay, so lobsters and human beings shared a common ancestor in the evolution some 500 million years ago. Okay, 500 million years ago is a long time. Lobsters also, similar to humans, our behavior is regulated by the dopaminergic system. So when a lobster if a male lobster fights another male lobster and wins, the male lobster that wins feels victorious, and he releases the brain releases dopamine to reward him for his behavior. That's the same chemical, the same neurochemical that you release in your brain when you make a great performance. Okay, that's the same neurochemical that the human brain uses to reward us for our behavior. You can give, if a lobster fights another lobster and loses, he'll feel depressed. You can give antidepressants to a lobster, and it will work in the same manner that if you were to give antidepressants to a human being, their mood will be elevated. So that's how deep social hierarchy goes. It's far, it's not a modern invention. Okay, social hierarchies, social status is not, it's not even a human phenomenon. It's a biological phenomenon. It goes way, way back. So comparing ourselves against each other and concerning ourselves with how other people perceive us, it's not just you. It's not just humans. It's a biological instinct for anyone who lives in any kind of social environment. So it's a deep instinct. And it's not something that we can simply try to ignore. So even if you think about it, an environment like a university class, okay, you have auditioned for a university class. You're studying music performance at a university. Yay, you're good to go, right? But then what happens? You enter a university class and maybe you're in a piano class or a violin class, and the other students are fantastic, and the other students are great. And you look at the other students and you start comparing yourself to them, and you start questioning yourself, wait a minute, who's the top lobster at our university? Is it me? Or is it maybe someone else? And that starts to regulate how you feel about yourself. It starts to regulate your mood. So it's kind of unavoidable instinct that this comparison and this competition for social hierarchy. And as musicians, our social hierarchy, sorry, our status as musicians also determines our success in our careers. If you think about it, who are the people who are given concert opportunities? Who are the people who are invited to play as soloists? Those are the musicians who have a great reputation, right? The musicians who don't have a great reputation are not so commonly asked to perform as a soloist. So then it's kind of unavoidable if you want to have a career that you have to climb the social hierarchy, and that hierarchy can be implicit or explicit. So an explicit hierarchy would be if you're a teacher at an institution, you have been formally assigned a higher position than the students, correct? So the great example would perhaps be if you're a professor. If you're a professor in music, you have been acknowledged by our civilization as one of the greatest experts on music. There's hardly any position greater than that, at least within academies. So that's an example of an explicit social status. So an implicit one would be if you're comparing yourself to your co-students and thinking, who's the better improviser among us? You're creating an informal or hidden hierarchy. Okay. This is for me very interesting to talk about, and I'd love to hear if you can just confirm, have you had this experience? What do you think about when I talk about this? Does it trigger any memories from your days as a student, or can you relate to it as it is now? I'd love to hear from you, if only to give myself a little break from talking to hear what you have to say about it. Yeah, and how does that make you feel when you compare yourself to others? Absolutely. Anyone else? I was just so curious. I was seeing Annemie smiling. I was very curious to hear how you could relate to this subject.
I have sometimes I feel jealous when a person understands better than me about a subject like, for example, science, math. I was like, why I can't understand? So yeah, I can relate to that.
Yes. So jealousy would be a consequence of that comparison,
Yes.
comparing ourselves to others. And sometimes that can be it can be useful. For example, if you're a leader of an orchestra, you're the artistic leader of an orchestra, you're setting a program and you want to invite a soloist. Wouldn't you want to invite the best soloist if you had to select between a few different musicians? Would you rather have a would you rather have a worse soloist or a better soloist? Of course, if you had to make the choice, you would choose the best soloist. And the same thing if you're running an institution and you're hiring a teacher. Okay, so you're making an advertisement, we're hiring teachers, and you have applicants. You have to judge the applicants. Somehow, you have to make the distinction, okay, between these applicants, we have to make a judgment who's the better teacher, who do we want for our position. So it's unavoidable. But how do we feel about ourselves when we're the ones who are being judged? Maybe not so good. There's a anecdote. I was listening to a famous psychologist, Jordan Peterson, doing a lecture, and he was talking about a client that he was working on who was not feeling too well, and the client was comparing himself to his roommate. I'm not feeling very successful in life. My roommate is much more successful, and he's so fantastic. And well, Jordan Peterson asked, "Well, who is this roommate of yours?" And the client said, "Oh, my roommate is known. You probably know him. He's Elon Musk, who is the famous inventor behind the Tesla cars, among other things. So he's like a engineering superstar. So if your roommate is Elon Musk, it's like having Marta Argerich as a roommate, as a pianist. Like maybe that's not the person you should be comparing yourself to." So that's important to think about, like who do we compare ourselves with and where do we draw the comparisons? If you compare yourself to your idols, it's easy to put yourself down if you're listening to your idols. But if you compare yourself to your peers, maybe that's a bit more balanced, right? So what then happens? Identification. I love this subject. What then happens to us as we enter these competitive social domains is that this is the tendency that often happens. It often happens to many of us. And I've seen this, especially in my work as a meditation teacher, what happens when you start identifying with what we do. So being versus doing. So take, for example, the sentence, "I am a pianist." Now, you might say, well, that's a factual statement. There's no problem with that. But if I follow that line of identifying with my role as a pianist, I can enter another identification, which is how other people perceive me as a pianist and how they treat me determines my value as a musician. And if I follow that line of identification, I can end up with this one. My perceived value as a musician, how others perceive me, determines how I value myself as a human being. If music is the only thing I do, if music is the only thing I care about, and it is the case for many of us who we pursue music so passionately, we devote our lives to our musicianship. Well, what then if our perceived, self-perceived or otherwise, our value as a musician, what happens if that is not being valued? How does that make me feel about my own value as a human being if music is all I care about? You can see how that can be a bit dangerous for your own self-esteem. Also, the reverse can happen. Let's say that I'm a fabulous musician and I have a fantastic career and everyone praises my performances wherever I go. What happens to my ego if I identify with my performing career? Well, then I have an inflated sense of self-worth. I might start to think that, oh, I'm a successful musician. I am more than others. And if you have met a person like this, you know who they are, you know what they're like. They're not pleasant to be around, right? And fortunately, Fortunately, not all great artists are like this. Fortunately, there are great there are great artists that are still humble as human beings because they don't identify their value as a human being to their success. They keep these two distinguished. But if you have met a great artist who attributes their human value to their success as a career, and that this can happen, for example, with conductors, not only, but soloists, they get this very inflated sense of self-worth, and they can be very difficult to deal with sometimes. So even if you have a successful career, it's not healthy for you psychologically or spiritually to identify your value with what you do. So if we look at the other side of this presentation slide, I have formulated these sentences a little differently. And maybe the difference is just semantic, but let's have a closer look. I play the piano. Compare the sentence I play the piano to I am a pianist. Okay, so one is identifying and the other one is saying, no, I'm a human being. Playing the piano is something I do. You see that distinction? It's a subtle distinction, but it's an important distinction. Because that allows me to say that how other people perceive me or how they perceive my performance, that reflects how they feel and think about my performance. Okay, that doesn't reflect necessarily anything about me, necessarily. It reflects how they feel and how they think about my performance. You see that little distinction? It's not just a semantic distinction, it's an important distinction, because then I can separate, okay, how they feel, how they judge my performance reflects how they feel, and it reflects how they think about my performance. But I am not my performance. I am me, I did a performance, they had a reaction to it. There's a quote by the actor Morgan Freeman that I really, really liked. And he said that one of the greatest lessons he ever learned as an actor was this. He chooses not to accept criticism from people that he would not approach for advice. So he only takes criticism for the same kind of people whom he would go to if he were to seek advice. Those are the people that he would go to for criticism. As a conductor, I found this to be very useful because when I do my work as a conductor, in any ensemble, without exception, there's always someone who is chronically pessimistic. And there's always someone who is always complaining, regardless. I've never found an ensemble where there's not one person who is always complaining. And if I trust that person, and if I take what they say personally, then I don't get to feel very good about myself, because they are always, if I ask them for their opinion, they always have something negative to say. But if I choose, okay, who are the musicians in my ensemble who I really, really respect? Who are the musicians that I would ask for advice? Those are the people that I want criticism for. Okay? So you can be selective. You can't choose to be completely aloof, because you have to function within the social system. You have to, if I as a conductor start ignoring the opinions of my singers, they fire me, right? If I just override their opinions all the time, they don't want to work with me. So we have to negotiate how other people feel about us and with our own integrity. And that brings me to another possible identification, which is my value as a human being is intrinsic. It's within me, it's intrinsic. What I do, my performances as a musician, as a teacher, are external. That's what I do. I play the piano. I conduct choirs. That happens out here. What I do out here doesn't affect my sense of value as a human being. So that allows, that little subtle distinction we made in the beginning, I am a pianist versus I play the piano, allows that deeper distinction on a spiritual level. If I am what I do, then what I do determines how I feel about myself. But if I say, no, I am, period, that's a complete sentence, I am, and then I do. And my value as a performer reflects my value as a performer, but not my my value as a human being. Such an important distinction. I found that in my work on myself, and also when I was practicing giving therapy to clients, a path that I chose not to pursue further. I found that when unrooting and dissolving unhealthy beliefs, like the belief that, oh, I'll never be good enough to be a professional musician, or I don't know if I'm ever gonna make it, things like that. Or it can be relationship issues. It can be things like, oh, I don't know if I'm ever gonna find anyone that really loves me. Beliefs about that, like that, you can try positive affirmations, and they sound like going to the mirror, looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, I'm a good person. You can do that, but that really doesn't hit as deep. What I found in my own experience and when practicing therapy on clients was that the most powerful transformations psychologically happened when the client was able to discover a spiritual belief about themselves, about their own nature. That seemed to go so deep that it sort of it transcended their beliefs about themselves that they had picked up through their social conditioning in their family, in their school, or in their education, or in their career. So that was very powerful. So that's why I put that point there in the very beginning. What about the spiritual health? What about your spiritual beliefs? Don't count them out. Even if you don't personally identify as a spiritual person, that's fine. I'm perfectly fine with that. Let's not underestimate the power or the potential of spiritual belief in psychological transformation. That's been my experience, and also my experience witnessing my work on other clients. Okay. I hope you're ready to follow me a bit further, because we're not quite done yet. Let's proceed. So what about these survival responses? I was talking about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So what happens to our performances if we're starting to feel a little uneasy? What happens to our body if we fear being judged for our performance? Well, you have the sympathetic nervous system, which has control over some survival mechanisms that we call fight or flight. You may have heard that term before, fight or flight. And you may have experienced this in your own performance when it happens. That can be in the form of anger. Maybe you felt like blaming or criticizing other people for your performance. I haven't experienced this personally, but I did witness it in a piano class. There was a fabulous girl, a very talented musician. She was playing Beethoven's third piano concerto in a piano class. So there was her, there was the professor, me, and a few other students. She made a couple of mistakes. Not many mistakes. In my opinion, trivial mistakes. I didn't care about them. But she made a couple of mistakes, and that was enough to throw her off. She threw a tantrum. She stopped performing. She banged her fists on the piano, creating a loud noise, startling everyone. So just playing a couple of wrong mistakes in that situation was enough for her to trigger an anger response. That was fight. That was so that was enough for her. You might also experience it as agitation, shaking, difficulty sitting still. It's because when the brain perceives that, oh, we're in a situation where we might be judged, worst case scenario, our tribe of musicians is going to expel us from the university. They're going to reject us, and we're going to be out in the wilderness all alone, and we're going to freeze to death. So, of course, you don't think that rationally, but remember what I said about the lobster. The systems that generate these patterns are in the brainstem. Okay, so these were evolved far before human beings were evolved, so they're ancient. So when that happens, the body starts increasing the blood flow to our arms and to our feet. So maybe you've experienced in a performance that your feet are shaking or your hands are shaking. If you're a wind player, you may have felt that your mouth is suddenly very dry and you can't really get the right humidity if you're playing on a woodwind. Singers can experience it. On singers, it's very audible if they're nervous, because you can feel the tension, you can hear it on their voice. And you may have experienced a desire to hide or conceal yourself or your performance. So that can be a bit obvious when I'm conducting choirs. I can tell immediately if any of my singers are feeling nervous because they start hiding physically and they start hiding their voice. So it's something that you can notice very clearly. So those responses, those reactions are survival responses. Literally, the brain is afraid that, oh, if something bad happens, if I play a wrong note, my tribe is going to reject me and I'm gonna die. That's what the brain believes on a very deep instinctual level. And that creates these patterns, and those patterns can create physical patterns of tension. So we all know how the body responds. Imagine that all of a sudden a dinosaur were to break through your door and you would go, okay, that would be the instinctual response. If a dinosaur were to break through your door, Jurassic Park style, you would go, and then what? You would hold your breath, right? So that's the other kind of response, which is the parasympathetic response to fear, which is freeze. Now, this is a response that I know very well. This is a response that I'm very familiar with because we all have different patterns, different tendencies. So some people are more prone to fight and flight. Some people are more prone to freeze. I'm a freeze person. When I get afraid, my body freezes. And knowing what kind of pattern you are is useful for developing your strategies for how you can deal with them. So you might experience this as numbness, a lack of sensation. Maybe suddenly you don't feel your instrument as well. Maybe you don't feel your hands as well. Maybe it's difficult if I ask you, how do you feel about this? How does this feel for you? Maybe it's difficult to come up with an answer. And the reason is your body is suppressing signals. Your brain is suppressing signals from your body in case of pain. Okay, your brain is anticipating pain and therefore suppressing signals from your body. Because if there's pain, let's say a tiger bites you in the leg. Do you have time to process pain? No, you gotta run. You gotta suppress that experience. The pain you can experience later. But the body is capable, the brain is capable of suppressing that signals, and that can happen during a freeze response. And then you have another one that's not so commonly referred to in this category, but it's another one that I feel that I identify very much with personally, and that's fawning. And you can experience that in social situations as a people pleasing others while neglecting one's own needs, fear of conflict, and being afraid of saying no. So you know that you're a fawning kind of person if someone asks you to do something and you're afraid of saying no, and you say yes, and then you regret later that you said yes. Have you ever had that maybe as a performer, if someone asks you, hey, can you come accompany my choir, and you know that you don't have time to do that, but you don't want to disappoint them, so you say, yeah, sure, I'll do it, and then you regret it later and you're like, why did I say yes to do this, right? If that's a pattern, now that can happen to any one of us. We can all overestimate our work capacity, but if that's a pattern, if that's happening in your work, if that's happening in your private relationship, if that's happening with your parents, you may want to look at that. That might be a pattern for you. And it certainly has been for me, for sure. So I see the clock is ticking. Now, I don't want to spend too much of your time, but I also don't want to rush the lecture. So let's move on to the what you're probably asking yourself. Okay, I recognize my pattern. I'm a flight person. Or I'm a fight person. I get angry all the time. Or I'm a freeze person. I get numb brain fog, cold hands all the time. Whatever. What do we do about it? The good news is that you can learn to regulate your nervous system. I wish I was taught this in university. I so much wish that someone taught me in university how to regulate my nervous system. No one ever did. I had to study it and figure it out otherwise. So remember what I said about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems co-regulating each other, and they negate each other. So if one of them is overactivated, you can reduce that activity by consciously engaging the other one, willfully. If we look at the sympathetic responses, fight or flight, those can often be seen attempted self-medicated using drugs or alcohol. That's very common, and it's also it's easily accepted in our culture to drink alcohol. And there's nothing wrong with that, but if it's being used as a form of self-medication to regulate our stress levels, it can be an unhealthy coping mechanism, short-term and long-term. And I have never experienced this myself, but I've heard rumors from multiple musicians in different genres, also classical musicians. I've heard people say that some musicians, they handle their performance nerves by taking medication. They take beta blockers. And maybe that's effective for them, maybe it works for them, and I'm not going to judge them for doing that. But sometimes you also know people do it, they try to self-medicate themselves using drugs and alcohol that are not prescribed from a doctor, and that's when things can get really nasty and you can develop an addiction. And it's really important to know this. I'm going to say it loud and clear. Either because it might happen to you or it might happen to someone you know, a colleague, a friend, or a family member. If there's a drug or alcohol addiction problem, the addiction is not the only problem. It's an attempt to self-medicate a deeper problem. So that's good. That's really useful to know that it's much more complex than just getting sober. A much healthier and a method that I would much rather recommend are breath work, yoga, and meditation. So how does the breath affect the nervous system? Allow me to show you. If we breathe in, breathe out. When we breathe in, we stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. So we increase oxygen level in the body. When we breathe out, we activate or we stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? So inhalation, sympathetic, increasing activity. Exhalation, parasympathetic, slowing down, relaxing. So if you have an overactive system, if your heart rate is going up, if you know that I'm in a sympathetic activity and it's a bit more than I would like right now, you can use long exhalations. So breathe in, long exhalation. And if you practice breathing with long exhalations, eventually your parasympathetic nervous system will start regulating your activity. If it's the other case, if you're having a freeze response, you can use the in-breath reflex. And it's important that it's a reflex, because if you start thinking, oh, I need to breathe, you can start hyperventilating, and that can increase your anxiety levels. So that's not a good strategy. But I've been working a lot in my own experience with the breathing reflex, which is, we can demonstrate if we all breathe in and we all breathe out and exhale everything, and then we hold the breath. There will be an instinct to breathe in. And if we allow that to happen, it's a natural, instinctual inhalation. And that's a sympathetic activity, and that can be very helpful, and I've used that a lot. Yoga, if practiced properly, can help regulate down the activity and the stress in the body. If practiced excessively, it can increase the level in your body. And I had that experience. I was trying to teach yoga to a roommate who was very stressed. And he would use the yoga practice to push himself further and just increasing the stress level in his body. For him, it was completely counterproductive. But properly practiced, it can help balance your levels. And perhaps the most important one, move, talk to someone, ask for help. It's not wrong to be angry if you have a legitimate reason for being angry. Okay? If something happens, if you're making a performance and the conductor completely screws you over, it's not your fault. And it's completely legitimate to be angry, and it's completely legitimate to go talk to them and say, hey, that wasn't okay. So it's not a bad thing to be angry, and you can always ask for help. If you have the parasympathetic freeze response, which I have had a lot, so that's been something I needed to work on, using physical activity to increase the sympathetic activity in my nervous system. Running, training, dancing, singing. And this one has been fantastic for my people-pleasing tendency. Practicing saying no, loud and clear, no. It's been so profound, and it might sound like a superficial practice just saying no, but I've been so fascinated in my work with singers and clients how difficult it is for some people to say no really loud and clear, and sometimes triggers this sense of uneasiness in them, as if they feel like they're doing something wrong by saying no, and that's so fascinating. So I've found that to be deeply transformative, just practicing saying no and doing somatic, so body-focused meditation that brings my awareness to my body and creates centeredness in my body. My condition of freeze has been worsened by cognitive meditation, and I really want to stress that as a meditation teacher. The meditation that I've been practicing, that I've been trained to teach, which is ascension meditation, is a form of cognitive meditation, so it's a mental practice. That's been counterproductive for my health, because when you meditate, you engage the parasympathetic nervous system. If you're in a state of freeze, your parasympathetic nervous system is active. If that's too much, you shouldn't increase it by meditating. Okay, so in my case, it was actually counterproductive to meditate. So that's something I really want to stress. It's not always that this one size fits all solutions, they don't work for everyone. Okay, I'm sure you have a bunch of questions, but I also want to respect your time and move ahead if that's okay. I'm almost getting through the end of the lecture, there's not many slides left here. Now, you might be asking, so having said all that, Bjørn, what's the point? What caused my injury and how did I recover from it? Okay, I had to go through all of that for you to understand my journey. I had to explain all of these things for you to understand what was going on with my injury and how did I recover from it. In the case of my injury, the underlying root cause of the injury was trauma. Trauma that caused me to repress anger. I don't have to explain the specifics of the traumatizing events for you to understand that I didn't feel safe expressing anger. So anger was an emotion that I suppressed. I didn't allow myself to be seen as angry. Okay, so I was always happy, smiley, people-pleasing kind of person. That repression caused physical tension in my chest, in my chest cage, in my rib. My breathing was constricted, there was tension in my shoulders, and it was chronic. And when there's chronic tension, it means I didn't notice there was any tension there, because that was normal for me. That's how I knew my body. But the tension was always there since I was very young. And that physical tension in my chest, remember I talked about fascia. So imagine the tissue like a t-shirt, like a sweater, one connective tissue connecting the chest to the arm. So if there's tension here, if there's something pulling here at the chest, it's going to create a limitation in the flexibility of the arm. So because of the tension in the chest, there was also an indirect tension in the muscles of the forearm, the flexors, the finger flexors that I were using extensively when playing the piano. So how did I make this connection? How did I connect the dots? Because I've been working on my technique for years. When I started studying Timani in 2016, I started retraining my coordination. I started looking at the physical components of my injury and started treating them. But it wasn't until last year that when I went to therapy and I started working on my emotions. It wasn't until I, with the help of a therapist, was able to release the anger that I had suppressed, that the tension in my chest started releasing. And it was when that tension in my chest started releasing that I realized, oh, there was tension there, because it had been chronic. It had always been there. I didn't know anything else. But then when the tension released, I started breathing normally. And when I started breathing normally, the tension in my arm was reduced, and it was only after that that I was able to really start working on my technique and my coordination without feeling any pain. And I really want to drive this point home. It wasn't the physiological work that made my recovery. It was the psychological work that I did on myself. Even though my injury was physical and the symptoms were physical and it manifested as an inability to play the piano without pain, the underlying causes were psychological. And it was only through, not only, but it was only until, it wasn't until I started a psychological treatment that the physical symptoms started easing. So it's important for you to, that's the one lesson I really want to impart on you. If you were to extract one thing out of this lecture, is this: piano technique is not just physical, and injuries and injury prevention is not just a matter of how you use your hands and fingers. It works on the whole system. Everything affects everything. That's my new motto. Everything affects everything. So that would be the moral of this story, and the insofar as I can call it wisdom, I guess that's the wisdom I would impart on you. When we're dealing with injury, we have to look at everything. So that would lead me to this: what is the proper level of analysis when we're dealing with injuries? Are we looking at the physical level, the pain, the symptoms, the muscles? Are we looking at the psychological level, the nervous system, stress, anxiety, trauma? Are we analyzing at the level of the individual? Could there be a genetic influence? Are we analyzing at the level of the unit? Is it a spine issue? Is it a muscular issue? Is it psychological conditions? So these are open-ended questions. Is it the level of the individual as detached from the social environment? Or should we analyze the social environment? What about your family? What about your school? What about your workplace, your relationships? So remember when I said we enter university and we enter this music class and we start comparing ourselves? How does that affect you psychologically? How does that affect you physiologically? How does that affect your technique? Okay, so you have to look at all the levels. Civilization, culture, economy. How does the economy affect you? If you know that if in order to sustain myself as a musician, I have to make great performances. If I make bad performances, what happens to my income? How am I going to survive as a musician? So you can look at that level, and you can even look at a spiritual level. When you're struggling, if you have gone through very deep struggles in your life, at some point, at least in my experience, you start asking spiritual questions, like what's the purpose of my suffering? Does God want this to happen? Is God trying to punish me, or what's really going on here? You start asking those big questions, and is that the proper level of analysis, or is it the physical level? So these are just open-ended questions. It's not obvious to me if a student comes to me and say, hey, I have pain in my arm, can you help me? Maybe I can, maybe I can't. Maybe the problem is way bigger than I know how to handle. So as I said in the beginning, the more I learn about this, the more I learn, I get more competence. I feel, yes, I definitely learn, I have experience, I have knowledge, more than many musicians perhaps. But that doesn't mean I'm an expert. That doesn't mean I know how to help other people, because their problem might be way more complex than I know. That was the case for me, at least. The experts that I met didn't know how to cure it. I had to figure it out through other means. So that brings me to the final slide and the final afterthoughts for this lecture. And that's a question for you. I invite you to think about it, and if you want to stay afterwards, we can have a little break first, and if you want, we can have a little conversation, a little discussion. What do you think? How can we, meaning you, how can you take responsibility by providing healthy and safe conditions for yourself as a musician, for each other as colleagues, for peers as students, and if you're a teacher, how can you provide a healthy and safe condition for you student to thrive? So that's something that I'm very conscious of as a conductor. How do I create healthy and safe conditions in which my singers can perform? How do I balance ambitions and ambitious repertory and performing in concerts or even competitions? How do I balance that with the psychological well-being of my singers so that they become inspired and motivated to perform, but not so stressed that it has a destructive effect on their well-being? Difficult questions, and I invite you to think about them and we can discuss them. So my final thoughts, and this is what I'll end with, is ultimately my health is my responsibility. There have been things happening in my life that I wish didn't happen, and if I wanted to, I could point the finger at others and I could blame them, but I don't. Ultimately, I choose to take responsibility for my own well-being and my own recovery. Having said that, though, I can still ask for help, and that's another really important point I want to bring up. In my case, taking responsibility for myself doesn't mean I have to do it alone. I still need help. I still need to ask people for help. I had a lot of help along the way, and I would not have been able to make a recovery if I were to only rely on my own resources. So that's another super important point. By all means, take responsibility for your own well-being, but you can still ask for help. Okay, that's my lecture. Thank you for attending, and it went just a little over an hour. So if you have anything else that you have to do, you're free to leave. If not, I would love for you to just stay a little while and we can have a little discussion about it. I'd love to hear what you think about it. Did this lecture make you think? Did it make you feel? Do you have any thoughts about it? Do you have any questions, things you would like to share or discuss? I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you. Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. So there's a mutual relationship between the mind and the body and the mind. So you can use. So there's. It's absolutely as you said. It's accurate. Our psychological state can affect us physiologically. It can affect our technique, and it's the other way around as well. So, for example, if everyone were to, clasp your fists like this and hold your breath at the same time, that will affect your brain. That will increase the stress levels. Same thing is if you move, and that's why I've been promoting these physical practices like yoga, for example. Properly practiced, it will help stabilize also your psychological conditions, and that's why yoga and meditation, the physical and the mental practices, are often complementary. They're not just separate practices. So absolutely, you can work. They affect each other, and you can start from one end and work on the other regardless. So you can work on a psychological root cause using movement, and and a psychological cause can affect your movement. So it's this very fascinating relationship between the mind and emotions and the body where it affects each other, but it's a mutual effective relationship.
Yes.
Absolutely, and performance psychology is so fascinating. What goes on in your mind as you're performing? Where's your attention? If a mistake happens, how you respond to it while you're playing, and how does that affect your the next moment of your performance, and so on. Super fascinating. Anyone else? I know there are more people in the audience, and I'd love to hear from more of you.
I did sort of want to ask something.
Yes.
I found that a lot of my problems seem to be somewhat similar to yours. I mean, fawning is kind of the story of my life. But I was really interested when you were talking about how cognitive meditation can like worsen it. What, in your experience, what is the antidote for that? What types of meditation have you found to be beneficial?
So I had the experience of just to clarify, my trauma response is freeze, parasympathetic freeze, numbness, and lack of ability to act in general, and people pleasing. And I was afraid of my own anger, so of course I was afraid of conflict. So I didn't know how to say no to people. So I was the ultimate people pleaser in that regard. And the way out of that was, in many ways, connecting with my anger through movement. So using aggressive movement, like physical training, kind of masculine training, and using the voice. I practice singing opera just for therapeutic purposes. I've been practicing opera. I've been practicing how to shout and use my voice and project my voice, and I found that to be deeply transformative. There's an intimate connection. If we look at the different health system, the yogic system, and the chakras that they explored in India, there's the connection between the heart chakra, which is self love, and the throat, which is self expression. So, how we express our self love or don't is connected through the heart and the throat, which are also, anatomically speaking, quite close to one another. So, if there's tension, if there's a blockage here, there might be a blockage here, and that really was something I explored using my voice, with connecting with my self love. You I may be detracting slightly from your question here, Caleb. You were asking about the meditation practice. Could you just repeat or clarify?
Yeah, well, I found it interesting that cognitive meditation has a negative effect on that because if I were to think of it, I would think that would some sort of, calming effect would be helpful in that regard. But I'm just curious what kinds of meditation you found
Oh yeah, sorry. That was.
beneficial towards.
I'll explain it better. So freeze is a parasympathetic survival mechanism. Meditation is an activity that stimulates your parasympathetic nervous system. So if my parasympathetic nervous system is way up here, way more than it should be, if I start meditating, it goes further up. It worsens my condition. So I was unable to act. I'll tell you a personal story. This might come as a shock to you, but there was a point in my life a few years ago where I was in such a poor condition neurologically that I was unable to even feed myself. So I would lay in my bed or sit in my chair and just watch cartoons basically all day. And then sometime in the evening, I would recognize I should probably eat. It would be a good thing if I were to eat today. Because rationally, there was still a part of my mind that was like, yeah, but Bjorn, this is probably not good for you. But the fridge was empty because I hadn't gone to the store in many days. So I had no food. I lived in the middle of the city. The store is 100 meters from my city. Okay, it's just right over the doorstep. And those 100 meters to the store and back again, when you're in a very poor neurological state, those 100 meters are far. So maybe sometime late in the evening, just before the store closes, I'll go to the store and I'll buy some frozen pizza. Because no way I have the energy or the ability to act to feed myself. So I just make some frozen pizza. So I'll give you a detail in my personal life. In that year, when I came home to see my parents for Christmas, I weighted myself. I'm a man at 182 centimeters. That's 6 feet for you Americans. And I weighted 58 kilos. I don't know what that is in pounds, but that is around 16 and a half BMI, I think. It's unhealthily, like dangerously underweight. So that was me a couple of years ago. That was how out of condition I was to even maintain myself, to even feed myself. So you might be able to imagine how in that psychological state, sitting down to meditate, to slow down the heart rate and the activity in your body is counterproductive. You can imagine that. Okay, so on the contrary, physical activity, physical movement that allowed me to connect with my body, and especially connecting with aggression. Aggression is a very powerful motivator for getting things done. And I was completely unable to get anything done, even something as primal as eating, as feeding myself. So I had to go in a completely opposite direction. And I can tell you, as a meditation teacher who'd been teaching meditation, that was very surprising to me. It did take a long time for me to realize that this meditation practices that I've been teaching and practicing, maybe that's not so helpful for me. Because that was a conflict of my own interests and my own values as a meditation teacher to admit that, okay, I have to stop meditating. It's not good for me, it's not healthy. So when I say somatic practices, I mean more like yoga, moving practices, practices that bring my attention to my body. So I had the experience that when I would sit down to meditate, I would very quickly have the desire to get up and move, because that was what my body wanted to do. It didn't want to sit still. It wanted to move. It wanted to act. It needed to re-engage action mode. So that's what I've been practicing for the past year or two. Okay, I hope that clarified that question. It's a great question.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for answering.
So I have a question. You talked a lot about learning how to say no. I actually struggle with that a lot, and I was wondering, like, is there any way that I could fix it or improve on it? Because it's a very big habit of mine.
Yes, practice it.
Practice.
Practice it on your own. You can use the bathroom. If you have a mirror where you can see your face, practice looking at your face and saying no. And that might feel uncomfortable, but really that was how I did it. I had to practice standing in the mirror, looking at myself and shouting no. And that would bring up fear in me. And I really tell you, everything, all the work that I have done on releasing anger has brought up a lot of fear in me. And a really, I suppose, intense part of the process has been allowing myself to feel that fear in connection to releasing my anger. And the meditation practice actually helped with that, because I had a lot of intense thoughts that I had to engage when I was doing my meditation training. And learning and doing some therapy prior, and just learning how to be with intense emotions, recognizing that it's gonna be fine. They're just emotions. I'm not gonna, although I have felt so angry at some point, I felt I was gonna explode. I felt so angry at some point, I could feel every nerve fiber in my body just going like wringing a sponge. It's like a burning sensation all over my body of anger. And of course I felt that was overwhelming. Of course it was uncomfortable. It was extremely intense. But that was part of the process. So it might be uncomfortable and you might feel a little uneasy doing it, but for me that was that was part of the process. Being comfortable with the uncomfortable.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anyone else? I thought I saw a question in the text chat from Anmi. Yeah, you found it interesting. I'm glad to hear that. Now, we've been here for an hour and a half. If you're feeling like you need a break, this could be a good time to round off. If you want to discuss this later, I'll be around. So shoot me a DM and we'll have a chat about it later if you want. Anyone else before we finish? I would be very glad if everyone could relate to what I said from their own personal experience and take away the parts of the lecture that they found were relevant for themselves and their own situation, and to expand your mind and your perspectives on how you can relate to your own challenges for a better future. Okay? Thank you so much for listening. I love doing this for you.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a nice day.